Have you ever stopped to think that life in ancient Rome wasn't just about emperors, battles, and conquests? Well, most of history was written in silence, in the almost invisible details of daily life. While today, we live in a rush, in noise, and with screens flashing all the time, the Romans woke with the sunrise, ate stale bread, shared precarious housing, and sought meaning even in the sights of birds in the sky. Sounds boring, perhaps, but it is precisely in this boredom that the secrets of how an entire civilization survived for centuries lie. The curious thing is that the more we look at these practices, the more we realize we're not so far removed from them. After all, who hasn't improvised a simple meal on a tight schedule or believed that a small gesture could change the course of something important? Ordinary life, when observed closely, is full of paradoxes, simple and complex, repetitive and grand at the same time. And perhaps therein lies the great shock. While we admire temples and armies, we forget that Rome was sustained by the noise of the streets, the labor of artisans, the shared bread, and even the gossip of public sources. It was in the tedious details that the empire found its strength. It seems counterintuitive, but without this daily foundation, there would be no glory. That's why, in this video, you'll delve not into the history of great generals, but into the daily lives of ordinary citizens. People who woke up early, worked hard, took a nap, and ended the day telling stories to children. People who, without realizing it, carried the weight of Rome on their shoulders. Now tell me something. Where are you watching this video from, and what time is it right now? I want to feel this connection between your present and the past we're going to explore together. In ancient Rome, life seemed to revolve around an invisible order that divided people into layers, almost like rungs on a ladder not everyone could climb. At the top were the patricians, ancient and influential families who carried prestige like those with a heavy surname. Below were the plebeians, ordinary citizens who worked hard to keep the city running. It was as if each person's destiny was written at birth, with no room for dispute. When we observe this division, we realize that it wasn't just economic, but also cultural. Patricians, for example, had access to refined education, mingled with senators, and attended banquet. Plebeians, on the other hand, made a living from manual labor, sold their goods in the market, and struggled to survive the hardships. If we think about it, even today, there are spaces that seem designed only for a few, such as exclusive clubs or gated neighborhoods. It's almost impossible not to see the similarities. And then there were the slaves, who had no rights and were seen as property. Their routine was marked by incessant work, without choice or freedom. It's hard to think that such a sophisticated society naturally coexisted with the idea that one human being could own another. This makes us reflect on how often, even today, people still feel trapped by jobs, debts, or situations that limit their freedom. The difference is that, in the modern world, the chains aren't always visible. Between slaves and free citizens, there existed a curious category, the freedmen. These were former slaves who gained their freedom but did not become equal to other citizens. They lived somewhere in between, bearing the mark of the past and the hope of a better future. It's similar to someone who emerges from financial hardship. They may even achieve independence, but they still feel the weight of old scars, and this shapes both their worldview and their attitude toward life. This class system silently demonstrated that coexistence in ancient Rome was characterized by privileges and restrictions. Imagine being at a party and realizing there are rooms you'll never be invited into. This was everyday life, coexistence, but without true equality. Interestingly, this structure also fueled conflict and revolt. After all, those at the bottom always look up in search of something more. And perhaps most interesting is to realize how, despite social distancing, everyone still crossed paths in the same public spaces: the forum, the narrow streets, the water fountains. It was in these places that patricians, plebeians, and even slaves saw each other, even though each carried the weight of their position. This is where the next detail of Roman life emerges: how the simple sunrise marked the beginning of a day in which all these classes met again, each in their own way. In ancient Rome, sunrise was not just the beginning of a new day, but a true collective ritual. As soon as the light touched the hills, the city awoke in unison, as if ruled by the same rhythm. Birds sang, merchants began to set up their stalls, and the hustle and bustle of the streets grew louder. Dawn was, in a sense, a silent announcement that each social class would once again occupy its place in the Roman machine. For the patricians, this time was reserved for business meetings or audiences with clients who came to pay their respects. There was something symbolic about this. Starting the day with deference reinforced their status. For the plebeians, the sunrise meant setting out for work, whether in workshops, in the fields, or on city construction sites. It's curious to think that in any era, dawn has always been a marker of duty, reminding us that time waits. The slaves, in turn, were already up and about before the first rays of light. They prepared their master's day, cleaned the atriums of their houses, and organized their work tools. It was a silent and repetitive daily routine, but one that ensured the routine of the most privileged. In comparison, it's like seeing people today wake up at dawn to open bakeries, fix buses, or prepare the city for when the majority wakes up. An invisible but essential job. Interestingly, sunrise also had spiritual connotations. Many Romans believed that the first moments of the day were ideal for observing omens, interpreting signs from the gods, and even making small offerings. It was as if the dawn held the promise of blessings if respected. To this day, many people feel that praying, meditating, or even exercising at dawn brings a different energy. There is, indeed, a psychological power in starting early. And there was also the practical factor. The lack of artificial lighting forced everyone to make the most of daylight. The pace of life was directly linked to the sun. Thus, those who woke up late lost precious hours of work, commerce, or socializing. It's curious how, even in modern times, productivity experts still advocate the habit of rising early, associating it with focus and discipline. In a way, this concept was already ingrained 2,000 years ago. But perhaps the most fascinating detail of the sunrise in Rome was the inevitable gathering of all the citizens on the move. The streets began to fill, the markets came to life, and the forum prepared to host political discussions. It was a daily starting point for the entire city, and it is precisely in this setting that we better understand the centrality of a public space that united different worlds. The famous Roman Forum, which held within itself the heart of social and political life. The Roman Forum was more than a physical space. It was practically the beating heart of the city. Imagine a vast center where everything happened simultaneously: commerce, politics, religion, and even daily gossip. There, patricians and plebeians inevitably crossed paths, even though each occupied a distinct social position. It was not just a square, but a living reflection of how Rome organized itself, discussed, and dreamed. At dawn, the forum was already filled with voices. Speakers stood on small platforms to address the people, vendors hawked their wares, and magistrates discussed laws and judgments. The sound mingled with the smell of spices, olive oil, and fresh bread. Curiously, this combination of stimuli is reminiscent of a modern day market where it's impossible not to be swept up in the action, even if you just want to pass by. The forum attracted, drew attention, and demanded presence. But the forum wasn't just practical, it was also symbolic. It was there that the idea of citizenship became visible. Compare it to a modern classroom. It's not enough to learn concepts, you have to live them. In the Forum, the Romans experimented with democracy, albeit imperfect, through debates, elections, and collective decisions. It was like a living laboratory where politics ceased to be mere theory and became tangible practice. For merchants, the Forum was a land of opportunity. Their deals were closed and contacts were made. If we speak of networking today, it already existed in a rudimentary form in Rome. Selling a batch of wheat, negotiating the price of wine, or leasing land could mean prosperity for an entire family. It was in this chaotic but productive environment that many plebeians sought to advance their social standing. Each transaction carried the hope of better days. Priests also had a prominent presence, as the Forum housed temples and altars. Religion and politics blended effortlessly, as if there were no boundary between the human and the divine. Interestingly, to this day, in many societies, public space remains a place where belief and power coexist. Whoever controlled the symbols in the Forum also controlled the collective narrative of the city. And finally, there was the human aspect. The Forum was the stage for unexpected encounters, reunions, and even intrigue. It was there that rumors of scandals, rumors of war, or news of new laws spread. More than stones and columns, the Forum was movement. And this accelerated rhythm of the space prepares us to look more closely at another essential element of the Roman experience, the simplicity and repetition of their daily diet, as revealing as their squares. In ancient Rome, eating was not only a biological necessity, but also a way to reaffirm one's social standing. The basis of the diet was simple: bread, olive oil, and wine. This triad was present on practically every table, from the humblest to the most affluent. Interestingly, although bread was common to all, its quality varied greatly. A patrician might enjoy a soft white loaf, while a plebeian munched on a harder one, made from coarse flour. Wine, so highly extolled by the Romans, also adapted to budgets and class. The wealthy had access to more refined varieties, imported from distant regions, and drank them at lengthy banquets. The poorer classes drank diluted versions, often of dubious quality. Interestingly, wine wasn't just for pleasure, it was considered safer than water, which was often contaminated. Even in this, we can see how Roman daily life already revealed a logic of practical survival. Olive oil, in turn, was practically a wild card in Roman cuisine, used for cooking, seasoning, and even illuminating. It was found in every home. Today, we speak of olive oil as something sophisticated and healthy, but in Rome, it was an essential item, as basic as rice and beans in Brazilian culture. In fact, there were entire markets dedicated to different qualities of olive oil, each aimed at a specific audience. It was a democratic product, but also a status symbol. And of course, there were the side dishes: Legumes, cheeses, and vegetables were frequently consumed, especially among the commoners. Meat was rare, generally reserved for special occasions or for the upper classes. Interestingly, fish played an important role, especially in regions near the sea. Compared to today, it's like imagining a table that always has the basics but saves the more elaborate dishes for special occasions. This logic spans the centuries. The way food reflected social status also makes us think about our current choices. How often is the quality of what we consume still a reflection of purchasing power? And what's more, how many food traditions were shaped by scarce Roman bread, made from barley and water, may seem bland, but it was precisely what gave workers energy to face the day. Simplicity was sometimes the greatest survival strategy. Ultimately, the Roman diet shows us that it's not just about what people ate, but what it meant to each social group. Bread, olive oil, and wine were symbols of collective identity, albeit lived in different ways. And if we look carefully, we'll see that even seemingly boring dishes like wheat or barley polenta held stories of effort and resilience. It is precisely this polenta that leads us to the next aspect of Roman life, even more repetitive and revealing. In Roman daily life, polenta made from wheat or barley was the dish that sustained the longest days. Simple, dense, and sparsely varied, it was a staple in the meals of those without access to meat or delicacies. To many, it might seem bland, but for commoners and slaves, it provided enough energy to face work. It was like rice and beans in Brazil or bread and butter for breakfast, a common but indispensable food. The curious thing is that this polenta had as many variations as creativity allowed. In its most basic form, it was just grains cooked in water, forming a thick paste. When possible, a little olive oil, grated cheese, or even herbs were added to add flavor. Imagine someone today improvising with instant noodles, simple, quick, and practical, but with small variations that make the experience less repetitive. The logic was very similar. It's also interesting to note the social contrast. While the poor were content with rustic polenta, the rich sometimes served it as a side dish, but with sophisticated touches like honey or imported spices. This detail reveals how even the same dish could carry different messages. For some, a symbol of survival, for others, a mere complement to banquets. It's proof that food has always told stories far beyond its flavor. If we think about it, Roman polenta also teaches us about resilience. How often in difficult times do modern families turn to what's most accessible and affordable, yet still provides basic nutrition? A simple dish can carry the strength of persistence. Just like a student surviving on ramen noodles in college, the Romans faced their daily battles with the help of this yellow pasta. And despite the monotony, there was an almost meditative aspect to preparing and eating polenta. Slowly stirring the grains in the pot, smelling the aroma rising with the steam, serving them in clay bowls. All of this created a silent ritual. It was as if the act of eating was also a reminder of humility, of being connected to the essential. A practice that, as simple as it may seem, connected the person to their own effort. And it is precisely in this repetitive, almost hypnotic cadence that we perceive another fascinating element of Roman life: the public baths, or thermae, which also had a certain ritual and routine, but now with a much more evident social dimension. After all, if polenta nourished the body, the thermae nourished social interaction. Roman baths were not just places of hygiene, but true social centers. Imagine large columned buildings with rooms for hot, warm, and cold baths. There, men and women, at separate times, would dive into the water to relax and chat. It was a communal, almost obligatory experience that marked daily life. Many went not only to cleanse their bodies, but also to catch up on the latest news and reconnect with acquaintances. Interestingly, going to the baths was accessible to different social classes. Although there were luxurious complexes, many baths were public and inexpensive, allowing even commoners and slaves to participate. Thus, the water created a rare space for social mixing. Think of a modern park or square. You might meet executives walking alongside students, each experiencing the same thing, albeit from different perspectives. The baths served precisely this purpose. But it wasn't just about baths. The baths offered gymnasiums for exercise, libraries, gardens, and even massage spaces. It was a complete environment designed for physical and mental well being. Imagine a modern sports center combined with a spa and a library. This was the multifunctional dimension of the baths. By visiting them, Roman citizens not only cared for their health, but also cultivated social and intellectual relationships. There are records of politicians using the baths to make discreet agreements, taking advantage of the relaxed atmosphere. Power, after all, wasn't restricted to the forum walls. A conversation between baths could define alliances or change destinies. This shows how the leisure space was, in fact, a strategic stage for serious decisions. It's similar to business meetings held in cafes or golf courses today. The atmosphere changes, but the logic remains the same. For the humblest of people, the baths also represented an escape from routine. It was a moment of rest, a relief after long hours of work. The hot water had a therapeutic effect, almost like a hug that restored strength. It's no coincidence that even today we associate a hot bath with relaxation and self care. In Rome, this was taken to another level, transforming the simple act of bathing into a communal ritual. In realizing this importance, we understand that the baths were not just places of hygiene, but of belonging. They were spaces that created a sense of unity amidst social divisions. After a bath, everyone left refreshed to face Roman life in their homes, and it is precisely in this contrast between dwellings, simple and luxurious, that the next chapter of daily life in the city. The insulae were the buildings where the majority of the Roman population lived. They were tall, often poorly designed structures that housed dozens of families in small spaces. Imagine narrow corridors, creaking wooden staircases, thin walls that didn't muffle the sounds of neighbors. They were simple dwellings intended primarily for commoners and urban workers. Despite their limitations, they represented home and the starting point for each person's day. The problem is that these buildings were often unsafe. Made of cheap materials, the insulae were vulnerable to collapse and fire. There are records of tragedies that decimated entire blocks due to a careless blade. This reality shows how the rush to accommodate a growing population resulted in daily risks. It's like hastily erected buildings in modern cities, where a lack of oversight compromises the safety of those who live there. Inside the insulae, space was minimal. Entire families were crammed into small rooms with poor ventilation and lighting. There were no private bathrooms. Toilets were relieved in makeshift pots, then emptied into the street. It may seem shocking, but it was a common and acceptable practice at the time. This forced coexistence with smells, noises, and limitations created an environment that shaped the residents' spirit. It's interesting to think that despite the hardships, there was also a sense of community. Neighbors shared food, cared for each other's children, and shared stories at the end of the day. It was a life of inevitable closeness. Many scholars say that bonds of solidarity were born precisely out of necessity. It's similar to modern communities where, even in the face of a lack of resources, unity flourishes. Adversity ultimately became a bond. Another detail is that the insulae were generally located on the upper floors, while the lower floors were occupied by shops and workshops. Those with a little more money could rent floors closer to the ground, considered safer and more affordable. The poor, however, lived on the higher floors, where the risk was greater. It was a hierarchy within the building itself, demonstrating that even in simple dwellings, social distinctions existed. And while the insulae were dominated by almost chaotic simplicity, on the other side stood the contrast of the luxurious domus, the homes of the wealthy. These residences were designed for ostentation, comfort, and position. This transition from small to grandiose allows us to better understand how housing reflected the status of each Roman citizen. While most lived crammed into the insulae, the patricians and wealthy citizens inhabited the so-called domus. These homes were true status symbols, designed to impress upon entering. Visitors were greeted by the atrium, a large open space filled with natural light. It was like a calling card, designed to convey power and refinement. The larger and more ornate the atrium, the greater the message of prestige conveyed. The domus were structured to balance privacy and ostentation. There were areas designated for the family, but also reserved spaces for receiving clients and political allies. It's like someone who today organizes the living room impeccably, but leaves the bedroom a little simpler, since only the family has access. Every detail had a social function, from the mosaics on the floor to the decorative fountains that adorned the interior gardens. The peristyle, for example, was an interior courtyard surrounded by columns, often adorned with plants and statues. There, residents could relax, converse, or hold private ceremonies. This space served as a reminder of the importance of nature even within urban areas. It's like modern backyards, or gardens that, even in large cities, function as havens of tranquility amidst the chaos of everyday life. The peristyle was, therefore, a breath of calm within the grandeur. Another interesting point is that these houses were also places of business. Patricians often received their clients and proteges in specific rooms where they discussed favors, agreements, and obligations. This practice reinforced the patronage system, which underpinned much of Roman politics. It's similar to modern business people who combine residence and office, transforming the home into a stage for decisions that reverberate far beyond its walls. Inside the domus, art was everywhere. Colorful frescoes on the walls, detailed mosaics on the floors, sculptures in the hallways. The decoration was not only aesthetic, but also a constant reminder of the residents' wealth and good taste. The home became a reflection of identity, just as today people choose furniture, paintings, and objects that communicate who they are. The difference is that, in Rome, this message also carried political and social weight. And, in the contrast between the luxurious domus and the overcrowded insulae, we perceive the gulf that separated rich and poor. However, both worlds met at the same point: street commerce, especially in the tabernae, the small shops that sustained much of urban life. The tabernae were small shops scattered throughout the streets of Rome, serving as the beating heart of daily commerce. Imagine narrow corridors lined with open doors, each revealing a different trade: bakers selling still warm bread, goldsmiths displaying jewelry, merchants offering wine or olive oil. They were modest but indispensable establishments, as they ensured the population's supplies. Anyone who passed by the tabernae could smell the smells, noise, and bustle that gave life to the city. These shops were often located on the ground floor of the instantly, allowing the owners to live above their workspace. It was a practical way to combine business and housing. Interestingly, this model is very reminiscent of the neighborhood businesses still found in modern cities, where the owner lives above the bakery or grocery store. The logic was simple: be close to the customer and make the most of the street traffic. In the tabernae, not only goods were sold, but also services. Barbers, blacksmiths, and artisans opened their doors to serve customers in their daily activities. This transformed the street into a kind of open air gallery where almost all daily needs could be met. The common Roman could leave home in just a few steps, get a haircut, buy food, and trade tools. This convenience was a hallmark of urban life. Interestingly, many tabernae also served as meeting places. Customers stopped not only to shop but also to chat, exchange news, and even discuss politics. It was a space for socializing, similar to today's bars and cafes. The simple act of buying bread could become an opportunity to hear rumors about the forum or discuss the outcome of a performance in the amphitheater. Tabernae were therefore small social hubs. The owners of these shops occupied a middle position in society. While they weren't as wealthy as the patricians, they weren't among the poorest either. Many prospered, expanding their businesses and earning a certain local respect. It was a chance for advancement within a rigidly divided society. In a sense, they were like today's entrepreneurs, who transform small businesses into pillars of livelihood and sometimes status. And while commerce bustled the streets during the day, there came a time when even Roman workers needed to slow down. After lunch, the pace slowed, the tavern doors temporarily closed, and the city plunged into a characteristic pause, the siesta, a curious habit that reveals much about the balance between effort and rest. In ancient Rome, after lunch, the city seemed to slow down. The noise of the streets diminished. Many taverns temporarily closed, and even the forum became less crowded. It was time for the siesta, a strategic pause to recharge one's batteries amid the heat of the day. This custom wasn't just about physical rest, but also a way to reorganize time. In a society that lived intensely from sunrise to sunrise, stopping was almost a necessity. It's interesting to see how this practice has survived through the centuries and still survives in many parts of the world, especially in hot countries. The logic is simple: when the body needs a break, insisting on continuing can be counterproductive. The Romans, unknowingly, were already applying wisdom that we now associate with modern concepts of productivity. It's like someone who does a power 20-minute nap to return to work more focused and creative. During the siesta, the wealthy took the opportunity to relax in their domus, often surrounded by slaves who ensured the comfort of the environment. Commoners, on the other hand, rested as best they could, sometimes on makeshift mattresses or even sitting on benches. This difference in conditions shows how even rest reflected social inequality. However, regardless of status, the act of stopping created a sense of shared humanity. The siesta also had symbolic value. It reminded everyone that life wasn't just about effort, but also about pause. While we talk so much today about the balance between work and rest, the Romans already lived it in practice. It's like that ancient advice: there's no point in running all the time, because even the horse needs to stop to drink water. This simple wisdom, repeated for generations, finds its echo in this Roman custom. And beyond rest, the pause had another consequence. It reorganized the city's rhythm. After the siesta, Rome gained new energy, with streets filling up again, markets rekindling, and political debates rekindling. It was as if there were 2 days in one before and one after the rest. This cycle of effort and pause kept the city active for much longer. It's interesting to note how the siesta also connected to politics, as leaders realized that keeping the people fed and rested was part of their control strategy. This vision connects to something larger and more controversial, which became known as bread in circuses, a resource used to ensure social stability amid tensions in Rome. In Rome, there was a curious strategy to keep the population under control, the famous bread in circuses. The idea was simple but powerful: offer free food and grand entertainment so that the people had no time or inclination to revolt. Thus, while gladiators fought in the amphitheaters and bread was distributed, many momentarily forgot the hardships of everyday life. It was a kind of collective anesthesia capable of calming social tension. Governments understood that feeding the masses was cheaper than facing protests. Large ships arrived from conquered territories carrying wheat, which supplied the public granaries. This wheat was then processed into bread and delivered to citizens. Interestingly, we still see governments adopting similar practices today, such as subsidies or social programs used as a way to maintain stability. The logic of feeding to calm seems to stand the test of time. But it wasn't just about food. The circus, with its spectacles, fights, and chariot races, offered people an emotional outlet. Imagine an entire city cheering in unison at a thrilling race or a bloody fight. It was pure intense emotion capable of distracting from hardship. In a way, it's similar to modern soccer. When the ball rolls, crowds forget their problems, even if only for 90 minutes. The controversial aspect of bread and circuses lies precisely in the fact that it didn't solve real problems, it merely masked them. While the population applauded gladiators or enjoyed free bread, inequality, corruption, and injustice remained untouched. It's like someone putting a bucket under a leaky roof instead of fixing the roof. The problem doesn't go away, it's just temporarily hidden. This was the harshest criticism leveled at the practice. On the other hand, for many poor citizens, bread and circuses represented a chance for moments of pleasure and dignity. Amidst the hardships of life, receiving food and experiencing great spectacles was something real and tangible. It wasn't just about political manipulation, but also a human need to feel part of something greater. This paradox is what makes the topic so compelling to this day. And while crowds cheered the races and battles, another equally symbolic detail stood out: the way each person dressed at these events. After all, clothing was also a marker of status, and in ancient Rome, everyday attire carried significance that went far beyond aesthetics. In ancient Rome, clothing wasn't just protection from the cold or heat, but a veritable social identity card. The tunic, for example, was the most common garment, worn by practically everyone, from plebeians to patricians. The difference lay in the details. The fabric, the cut, and even the color revealed the wearer's status. A simple tunic made of thick wool indicated humility. One made of light linen or fine cotton indicated greater prestige. It was impossible to dress without communicating something. Patricians, on formal occasions, resorted to the toga, a bulky and heavy garment. that required skill to wear. Wearing a toga was not practical, but symbolic. It demonstrated citizenship, respectability, and power. It was like wearing a suit to an important meeting today. However uncomfortable it might be, the toga was the mark of those with political rights and responsibilities. Those who wore it carried with them a message of belonging to the elite. Women wore the stole, a long tunic that conveyed modesty and dignity. Married women or those from respectable families displayed it as proof of social standing. Many complemented it with colorful cloaks and jewelry, creating outfits that revealed both vanity and tradition. It's interesting to note that just as today, fashion also functioned as an expression of identity. A Roman woman could communicate elegance and influence simply by her dress. Slaves and poorer workers, on the other hand, wore simplified versions of these garments, made from cheap fabrics and without adornment. Their clothes were functional, designed to withstand long hours of physical exertion. This difference in quality of clothing reflected the very structure of society. Some lived to display status, others simply to survive. It was like comparing the basic uniforms of workers with the formal attire worn at luxurious events. Interestingly, even children had their own distinctive style. They wore the toga praetexta, a version with a purple border, a symbol of purity and protection. This detail reinforced how Roman clothing was imbued with meanings that went beyond fashion. Each piece spoke, each color conveyed a message, each fabric told a story. Clothing in Rome was a social code that everyone learned to decipher from an early age. And among all these pieces, there was one that stood out for its almost ceremonial importance: the toga. More than a simple garment, it became the greatest symbol of citizenship and status, carrying with it an aura of power that deserves further exploration. The toga was undoubtedly the most emblematic garment of ancient Rome. Unlike the common tunic, which anyone could wear, the toga was the exclusive privilege of Roman citizens. Wearing a toga was not just a fashion statement, but a public declaration: I belong to the city, I have rights and duties. It was like carrying a visible document, recognizable by anyone. Anyone walking the streets wearing a toga was immediately identified as someone who held citizenship. However, wearing the toga was no simple task. It was a long, heavy piece of cloth that needed to be skillfully wrapped around the body. Often, slaves themselves helped their masters put it on, as it required practice. Imagine someone today trying to tie a complicated tie or wear a formal gown that requires help. This was the daily challenge of the toga. Comfort wasn't the priority, the symbolic message. There were different types of toga, each with its own meaning. The pure white toga represented the common citizen. The toga praetexta, with a purple border, was worn by magistrates and young men from noble families. The toga picta, embroidered and colorful, was reserved for victorious generals and emperors. It was almost like prestigious uniforms in modern societies, where every detail of the garment communicates rank and function. The toga, in this sense, was a social code. Interestingly, the physical weight of the toga also reflected a symbolic weight. Wearing it meant carrying not just a piece of fabric, but the responsibility of representing Rome. It was a constant reminder that citizenship came with obligations. Many citizens, in fact, avoided wearing it outside of official occasions precisely because of the discomfort. This makes us reflect on how status symbols often demand sacrifices that are impractical in everyday life. In ceremonies, elections, and court sessions, the toga became indispensable. It was a garment that commanded respect, almost like a uniform or gown in modern times. Seeing someone in a toga was an immediate recognition of their authority, and this collective recognition was fundamental in a society where public image was as important as actions. The cloth wrapped around the body was in essence a symbolic armor, and if the toga marked the public space, there were also symbols within Roman homes that revealed another essential aspect of daily life: domestic religious rituals, small daily practices that gave meaning to existence and kept the gods always close. In ancient Rome, religion wasn't restricted to imposing temples or public ceremonies. Within each home, there was a space dedicated to the gods called lyres and penates, protectors of the family and home. It was common for residents to make small offerings to these domestic altars early in the morning, lighting lamps, laying flowers, or pouring drops of wine. These simple gestures were seen as guarantees of protection and prosperity for the day. Rituals were passed down from generation to generation, and each family had its own customs. Some prayed silently, others repeated short chants, and some even left pieces of fresh bread as a token of gratitude. It was like the modern custom of saying a prayer before meals or keeping religious symbols in the living room. Small rituals that, though discreet, provided a sense of security and belonging. It's interesting to note how these altars were placed in strategic locations throughout the home, usually near the atrium. This demonstrated the importance of religion in everyday life. It was at the center of domestic life, always visible. It wasn't hidden, but integrated into the living space. Imagine today someone placing family photos or sacred objects prominently in the living room. It's a way of expressing that these are essential to the home's identity. These rituals also revealed how much the Romans viewed the gods as an active part of life. They weren't distant deities, but close presences, almost like invisible guests in the home. Therefore, they treated them with daily respect. It was a reminder that success, health, and even harmony between family members depended on this relationship. It's like someone who today believes that lighting a candle or meditating in the morning can open paths throughout the day. Interestingly, these domestic rites coexisted with the great public cults without conflict. A Roman could, on the same day, offer bread to his household gods and then attend a sacrifice in a temple in the Forum. It was a multifaceted religious experience, uniting the intimate with the collective. This balance between the private and the public reinforced the idea that religion was everywhere, at all times. And if faith manifested itself even within homes, it was also reflected in public spaces. After all, the water supply, considered vital to life, was often seen as a divine gift. This is precisely where public fountains come in, another striking detail of Roman daily life. In ancient Rome, water was a precious commodity, and much of the population depended on public fountains for their supply. These fountains, fed by the famous aqueducts, were inevitable meeting points. Early in the morning, men, women, and even children carried amphorae and buckets to fill, often facing long lines. The scene was repetitive: trivial conversations, complaints about waiting times, and even exchanges of news, all revolving around water. Interestingly, the springs weren't just for drinking. The collected water was used for cooking, washing clothes, and maintaining some level of household hygiene. Therefore, each family had to carefully calculate how much to carry. It was common to see people balancing heavy containers on their shoulders or on makeshift carts. If we think about it, it's not much different from communities today that still depend on wells or water trucks. The routine of searching for water shapes the rhythm of life. Beyond their practical function, public fountains also had symbolic value. Water was considered a divine gift, and access to it demonstrated Rome's power and organization. Building aqueducts was not just engineering, but also political propaganda. It demonstrated that the state cared for its people. Imagine today a major infrastructure project, such as a bridge or subway, being inaugurated with speeches from authorities. The effect was similar, albeit on a different scale. The springs also served as meeting places. While waiting their turn, residents exchanged advice, made business arrangements, or simply commented on what was happening in the forum. For many women, in particular, this moment was a rare opportunity to socialize outside the home. It was a respite from their busy routine, transforming the search for water into a brief respite from community life. But access wasn't always equal. Wealthy families who lived in luxurious domicile could have water piped directly to their homes, something unthinkable for commoners. This difference reinforced social inequalities. While some enjoyed the privilege of abundance, others had to face daily queues. It was yet another reflection of how Rome, even in its advanced state, was still marked by contrasts. And this contrast became even more evident when we considered the streetscape, which, in addition to fountains, was also filled with constant noise. Vendors, animals, and carriages created a soundscape that was part of everyday life, revealing another curious facet of the city. The streets of Rome were anything but silent. From the early hours of the morning, the sound of merchants hawking their wares could be heard, each trying to stand out amidst the hustle and bustle. Fresh wine, cheap olive oil, warm bread, voices overlapping like a chaotic symphony. Added to this was the rumble of cartwheels on the uneven pavement, a metallic creak that repeated like an incessant background music. Animals were also part of this urban soundtrack. Horses neighed, oxen mooed, dogs barked, and even chickens escaped from their baskets, running among passers-by. For a modern traveler, visiting Rome would have been like immersing yourself in a gigantic, endless market. Curiously, this sonic chaos is reminiscent of modern-day cities, where horns, voices, and engines mingle relentlessly, creating a lively but also tiring atmosphere. This noise was not only annoying, but also indicative of the city's vitality. Where there was movement, there was commerce, there was life. Silence, in contrast, was often associated with abandonment or danger. Therefore, the Romans were already accustomed to living with excessive sounds. It was as if the noise were the natural soundtrack of a sprawling metropolis, a constant reminder that the city never completely slept. Interestingly, for the residents of the insulae, this noise was even more intense. Living on high floors meant hearing the mix of voices echoing from the streets without any sound insulation. Imagine trying to rest while vendors discuss prices or carts pass by late at night. It was a real challenge, but also part of normality. Noise, in this sense, became an inevitable companion. Even the wealthy, who lived in more secluded domes, were not exempt from this sound. Although they had more privacy, they were also reached by the sounds of religious processions, military parades, or public celebrations. Rome, after all, was a city that lived outward, where the collective prevailed over the individual. Silence was rare, almost an unattainable luxury, and it was in this vibrant, noisy, and ever-changing environment that the essential trades that kept the city running emerged. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, bakers, and countless other workers became essential components of this urban symphony. In ancient Rome, much of the economy revolved around artisanal labor. Blacksmiths, potters, weavers, carpenters, and bakers brought the city to life with their skilled hands. The sound of hammers, the smell of baking bread, the heat of furnaces, all of this was part of daily life. These crafts were not only a means of sustenance, but also symbols of identity. Each artisan carried with them a tradition, often passed down from father to son, ensuring the continuity of practical knowledge. Blacksmiths, for example, were crucial, producing everything from agricultural tools to weapons for soldiers. Potters, meanwhile, shaped vases and amphorae that stored wine, olive oil, and grain, essential items in Roman life. Each piece bore a unique mark, like a silent signature of its creator. It's curious to think how, even today, artisanal products inspire admiration precisely for this reason. They are not just objects, but stories condensed into matter. Another highlight were the weavers, who worked with wool and linen to make simple garments as well as refined fabrics for the wealthy. The repetitive rhythm of the looms was almost hypnotic, recalling the constant effort of those who depended on this craft for their livelihood. It's like imagining modern seamstresses who, with needles and thread, not only produce clothes, but also support entire families. Each stitch was, in fact, a link between necessity and art. Bakers also occupied a special place. Their batches supplied everyone from plebeians to patricians, with varieties ranging from dark, hard bread to soft, light bread. The smell of fresh bread in the streets was irresistible, drawing lines outside the bakeries. To this day, there is no aroma more inviting than that of bread, fresh from the oven. This sense of welcome, so present in our lives, was already an intense part of Roman daily life. These artisans, though essential, were often underestimated by the upper classes. However, without them, the city's machinery simply wouldn't function. They were like the backstage of a show, invisible to some, but indispensable to all. This logic still persists when we consider professions that rarely receive attention but sustain the functioning of an entire society. And if during the day artisanal work dictated the rhythm of the streets, there was another space where the pace was much slower and more drawn out: the schools of rhetoric, where young Romans learned the art of speech in long and exhausting sessions. In ancient Rome, speaking well was almost as important as fighting well. Rhetoric schools were where young men learned the art of oratory, a fundamental requirement for those who dreamed of holding political or judicial office. There, they spent hours repeating speeches, analyzing arguments, and memorizing persuasive structures. It was a long and grueling training, but it shaped leaders. After all, in Rome, convincing through words was often more powerful than winning with the sword. Rhetoric teachers, known as rhetores, were respected figures. Many came from Greece, bringing with them refined techniques and ancient philosophies. The method was repetitive: reading aloud, improvisational exercises, mock debates. To the students, the routine might seem monotonous, but it was precisely this repetition that created fluency. It's similar to learning music or sports today. Excellence comes from constant practice, not from momentary inspiration. It's interesting to note that in rhetoric schools, they taught not only how to speak, but also how to think. Every argument required logic. Every metaphor had to make sense. Every pause was calculated. It was like an intellectual laboratory where not only the voice, but also the mind. If today we value communication and leadership courses, Back then, this learning was already seen as a key to social success. But of course, there were differences. Not everyone had access to this type of education. Only wealthy families could afford these schools, which reinforced the inequality between patricians and plebeians. While some learned to speak before crowds, others barely had time to listen, busy as they were with their manual tasks. This distinction reminds us that education has always been a divider. For students, mastering rhetoric was also a way to gain prestige. A young man who excelled in debates gained immediate respect and attracted the attention of influential patrons. This opened doors to brilliant careers in the courts and the Senate. It was like a student who excels at renowned universities today. Brilliant performance ends up being a password for greater opportunities. And precisely in this context of favors and opportunities, one of the pillars of Roman social life comes into play: the patronage system, which linked clients and patrons in relationships of power and dependence. In ancient Rome, social relations were sustained by an invisible but very powerful mechanism: patronage. On one side were the patrons, wealthy and influential men, usually patricians. On the other were their clients, who could be plebeians, freedmen, or even foreigners seeking protection. This relationship was not merely economic, it was almost like a moral contract. The patron offered favors, legal support, or even financial assistance, while the client reciprocated with loyalty. And interestingly, this system was repeated daily in a fairly common scene. Early in the morning, clients would head to their patron's domus to greet him. This ritual was called salutatio. Imagine lines of people waiting at a politician's door, each asking for something or offering something in return. It was a parade of mutual dependence. The patron displayed power by having many clients, and the clients gained prestige by being connected to someone influential. This game of favors underpinned much of Roman politics. Needing witnesses at a trial, the patron summoned his clients. Wanting applause during a speech in the forum, there were the clients, ready to bolster his image. It's like today, when public figures mobilize followers or supporters to create social impact. The difference is that, in Rome, this practice was institutionalized and part of the social fabric. For clients, this relationship meant access to opportunities they couldn't achieve alone. A small merchant, for example, could secure better contracts thanks to a patron's protection. A freedman could secure protection against legal injustices. It was a social ladder based on favors. However, this ladder had its limits. A client rarely became the patron's equal. The balance was always maintained in favor of the more powerful. Interestingly, many patrons also competed with each other to show who had the most clients. The number of people who passed the salutatio was almost a social trophy. It was like measuring influence by the size of one's network, something that today is very similar to the obsession with social media followers. The more clients, the greater the prestige. This parallel shows how the quest for influence spans centuries, only changing the setting. And while clients' lives revolved around waiting and returning favors, there were also leisure activities that brought rich and poor together in more leisurely pursuit. One such pastime was board games, a simple practice that revealed how Romans sought interaction and strategy, even in their leisure time. In ancient Rome, leisure wasn't limited to grand spectacles in the circus or amphitheater. Simple and accessible entertainments were also available, such as board games. These pastimes were common among both rich and poor, revealing a universal taste for strategy, intellectual challenge, Boards were scratched into the ground, made of wood or carved in stone, and the pieces could range from pebbles to small bones. All it took was creativity to transform any surface into a stage for entertainment. One of the most popular games was Ludus Latrunculcorum, similar to modern chess or checkers, required players to capture their opponent's pieces with calculated moves. The practice developed reasoning and patience, as well as stimulating a competitive spirit. Interestingly, soldiers also played during military campaigns as a way to train their minds and pass the time. It was a mix of leisure and strategic exercise, something that went beyond simple entertainment. Another well known game was Tesserae, similar to our dice game. It was used not only for fun but also for gambling. In fact, the habit of gambling for money or small goods was so common that it often generated controversy. Roman law even attempted to limit gambling, but as is the case today, the practice continued in alleys and taverns. The allure of luck seemed irresistible. Interestingly, these games created moments of socialization. During work breaks or afternoons off, neighbors would gather around makeshift boards. It was a chance to talk, laugh, and even forget the hardships of everyday life. For a moment, the simplicity of playing revealed a basic human need, connecting with others through play. Even the wealthiest in their luxurious damas dedicated time to games. While some saw it merely as a distraction, others saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate intelligence or cunning. It was like today when friends gather to play cards, video games, or even chess in public squares. The essence remains the same, the search for challenge and companionship. And while these games filled the day with lightheartedness, the Roman night held another kind of gathering. When the sun set, families gathered for the cena, the most important meal of the day, where food and conversation blended in a ritual of conviviality. In ancient Rome, the cena was considered the main meal of the day. Unlike a simple breakfast and a light lunch, the evening brought with it a more complete feast. For the poor, it consisted of bread, cooked vegetables, polenta, and, when possible, a little cheese or dried fish. The wealthy transformed the cena into a spectacle, several courses of dishes, unlimited wine, and elaborate desserts. It was more than just eating, it was experiencing abundance. Families gathered around low tables, and the more affluent lay on divans, propped up with cushions, while servants brought them the delicacies. This habit of reclining was both comfortable and ostentatious. It was a way of demonstrating status, as only those with time and resources could afford to eat slowly, in long intervals. For the commoners, the meal was quick and convenient, as the next day's work already awaited them. Interestingly, the patricians' menu included exotic dishes, rare birds, meats seasoned with spices from far away, fish imported from distant regions. All of this served not only to satisfy hunger, but also to impress guests. Eating well was a way to demonstrate power and influence. It's similar to grand modern dinners, where the lavish table is not just about food, but also about prestige. The scene was also marked by conversation. It was a time to share news, discuss politics, tell stories, and even recite poems. Meals became arenas of ideas, where every word could make or break reputations. This habit shows how in Rome, social life was always intertwined with daily rituals. Eating was also an opportunity to position oneself in the social landscape. For the children, the scene was a learning experience. There they observed how adults behaved, learned etiquette, and absorbed the value of coexistence. Small gestures, like serving wine or respecting turn taking, shaped future citizens. It's like today, when a family meal teaches much more than good manners. It teaches belonging, discipline, and even ambition. But not everyone welcomed such abundance. Many Romans criticized the excessive luxury and extravagance of these meals. For them, excess was a sign of moral decadence, a topic that generated heated debate and leads us to reflect on the limits of consumption in that society. In ancient Rome, not everyone welcomed the ostentation that spread across the tables of the rich and the endless banquets. Many philosophers and more conservative citizens criticized excessive luxury, associating it with moral decadence. For them, excessive wealth and pleasure corrupted the traditional values of discipline, courage, and simplicity that had built Roman power. It was a legitimate concern. A society that loses itself in pleasure risks weakening its own foundation. A classic example was the criticism of banquets featuring exotic dishes, such as flamingo tongues or rare eels. These excesses were seen as absurd, given the hunger many commoners faced in the insula. The stark difference between the abundance of the elite and the scarcity of the poor became a constant source of controversy. It's similar to modern discussions about inequality. While some have access to luxurious dinners, others can barely afford the basics. Moralists also warned that attachment to luxury weakened the Roman warrior spirit. Instead of seeking glory on the battlefield or in public service, many young patricians lost themselves in parties, expensive clothes, and easy pleasures. It was as if Rome's greatness was being exchanged for dangerous comfort. This view echoes the current criticism that overly complacent societies eventually lose their innovative strength or their ability to face challenges. Beyond food, luxury manifested itself in opulent mansions, extravagant jewelry, and clothing dyed purple, a color reserved for the wealthy. Every detail was carefully considered to make a difference. However, this accumulation of visual symbols also provoked envy, resentment, and social instability. It's no coincidence that many conflicts and rebellions arose from the contrast between luxury and poverty. The brilliance of some fueled the revolt of others. Even so, there were those who defended luxury as the engine of the economy. Merchants, artisans, and traders grew rich by catering to the whims of the wealthy. It was an inevitable contradiction, criticizing excess, yet relying on it to fuel the city. This tension demonstrates how complex Rome was, oscillating between traditional values and modern desires. Ultimately, the debate over luxury was never just economic, but also ethical. And in this scenario of criticism and contrasts, there was a constant presence that permeated all social classes: slaves, invisible to some, indispensable to all. They silently sustained Roman daily life in all its forms. In ancient Rome, slaves were everywhere, yet they were often treated as invisible. They worked in homes, fields, mines, workshops, and even schools. Their presence was so common that it became a natural part of daily life. For a patrician, waking up to breakfast prepared, clothes straightened, and a clean house was only possible thanks to slaves. They were the silent engine that kept Roman life moving. The origins of slaves varied. Many were prisoners of war, brought from regions conquered by the empire. Others were children of slaves, born into servitude. There were also those who fell into debt, slavery, losing their freedom in exchange. This diversity meant that Rome had slaves of all origins, languages, and cultures. forming a heterogeneous mass that sustained the economy. The work performed was as diverse as their origins. Some slaves performed the heaviest tasks, such as carrying stones for construction or plowing fields. Others, more educated, worked as teachers, accountants, or secretaries. There were even doctors who were slaves. This diversity demonstrates how slavery in Rome was not limited to physical exertion, but also extended to areas of knowledge and management. The lives of slaves, however, were marked by instability. They could be sold at any time, separated from their families, and subjected to severe punishments. Even those who held more privileged positions, such as guardians or administrators, never ceased to be property. This constant state of insecurity made it clear that, for Rome, freedom was a privilege for the few. It is a painful reminder of how human dignity was relativized in the name of power. Despite this, there were paths to freedom. Some slaves were freed by their masters in recognition of their faithful service. Others were able to purchase their own freedom with accumulated savings. Once freed, they could work independently, even though they carried the stigma of their past. It was like carrying a shadow that never completely disappeared. Still, for many, this opportunity represented a new beginning. And in this contrast between servitude and freedom, one sees how social mobility in Rome faced tough but not insurmountable barriers. It is precisely in this transitional space that another aspect of daily life entered the picture: transportation by cart, a system as noisy and slow as the dynamics of Roman streets themselves. Carts were the primary means of transportation on the streets of Rome, used to carry goods, construction materials, and even people. They were a part of the everyday landscape. But contrary to the romantic image many have, traffic was slow, noisy, and chaotic. The wooden wheels creaked on the cobblestones, and the animals pulling the carts, oxen or horses, struggled through the crowds. Traveling was always a mixture of patience and persistence. Interestingly, during the day, many carts were prohibited from circulating in the busiest areas of the city to avoid congestion in the forum and markets. This meant that most heavy transport took place at night. Imagine trying to sleep in an incitadel with the sound of wheels, hooves, and shouts echoing through the narrow streets. Your rest was constantly interrupted, and there were no windows thick enough to muffle the sound. For merchants, carts were indispensable. They carried grain, olive oil, wine, and other products to markets. Without this transportation, the city would simply grind to a halt. At the same time, the Romans knew that roads had limits: narrow, unmarked, and winding streets. Chaos was inevitable. It's like modern traffic jams. While irritating, they're the price of keeping a large city running. The wealthy, in turn, used more sophisticated carriages or sedan chairs to get around. Some were decorated with luxurious details, marking the status of those being transported. However, even with their pomp, they were still subject to slow traffic. It was like a luxury car stuck in traffic. However imposing, it couldn't escape the reality of the street. The carriage, in this sense, was a metaphor for urban life itself. Everyone, rich or poor, faced the same obstacles. Furthermore, there was a practical detail. Transporting carts increased the risk of accidents. Tired animals could stumble, wheels broke easily, and collisions were common. Many reports speak of goods scattered on the ground or injured pedestrians. This vulnerability demonstrated how Roman life was marked by unpredictability, even in something as mundane as travel. And while the carts carried the weight of everyday life, there was another space that concentrated a different kind of burden, the emotional one. The amphitheaters, stages of bloody and controversial spectacles, were the place where the people released their tensions amid gladiatorial fights. Amphitheaters were some of the most iconic spaces in Roman life, symbols of grandeur and at the same time brutality. The largest and most famous of them, the Colosseum, housed tens of thousands of spectators who gathered to watch gladiator fights, exotic animal hunts, and reenactments of historical battles. These events were free, sponsored by politicians seeking prestige and votes. For the people, it was a blend of leisure, excitement, and collective catharsis. The fascination with gladiatorial fights was impressive. Men, and sometimes even women, faced each other to the death, armed with swords, spears, or nets. The audience cheered with every blow, as if experiencing the combat alongside them. It was violence transformed into a spectacle. Today, we can compare this phenomenon to the passion for contact sports, such as boxing or MMA, only taken to the extreme of life and death. The bloodshed was an essential part of the entertainment, but amphitheaters weren't limited to human combat. Often wild animals brought from Africa or the East were released into the arena for hunting. Lions, tigers, and elephants became attractions, demonstrating the empire's reach and Rome's ability to dominate even the most dangerous beasts. It is a spectacle of power. While the people were impressed, the rulers reinforced the image of an invincible city capable of subduing any enemy, human or animal. There was, however, a controversial side. Many philosophers and thinkers criticized these practices, considering them signs of moral decay. To them, witnessing death as a form of leisure reflected a society moving away from higher values. But the truth is that the majority of the people were thrilled with each spectacle. The amphitheater was the place where everyone met, rich, poor, slaves, and senators. Their status disappeared in the face of collective emotion. Interestingly, amphitheaters also functioned as political tools. A ruler who sponsored grand games won the people's favor, even if his administration was questionable. Entertainment, in this case, served as a smokescreen for deeper problems, an amplified version of the bread and circuses logic. It was emotion replacing critical thinking. And while crowds gathered to shout and cheer in the amphitheaters, the reality in the insulae was quite different. The silence of the night was often broken by the discomfort caused by the lack of hygiene and sanitation, a situation that posed enormous challenges for the poorest residents. In the insulae, hygiene conditions were far from ideal. Without private bathrooms, residents used makeshift pots or buckets, which they then emptied directly into the streets. The smell permeated the air, mixing with the constant noise of the city. For those who lived there, this was normal. Imagine leaving home early in the morning and having to dodge leftovers thrown out of windows. This was a common scenario in many parts of Rome. This lack of basic sanitation favored the spread of disease. Epidemics spread rapidly, striking the poorest in particular. Fevers, infections, and intestinal problems were common, and few had access to adequate medical care. Even so, the city continued to function, fueled by the resilience of those who learned to live with these risks. It's like modern communities that survive without treated sewage, where life insists on flourishing despite adversity. The wealthy, in contrast, enjoyed much better conditions in their domus. Many of them had bathrooms connected to rudimentary sewage systems and access to running water. The difference between social classes was evident, even in the most intimate details of life. While some suffered from filth, others made hygiene part of their comfort. It was an inequality that was repeated daily on every street, on every corner. Still, there were collective attempts to maintain some level of cleanliness. The Romans relied on systems of sewers and underground canals that drained some of the city's waste. However, this service didn't reach all areas, leaving many neighborhoods neglected. It was like a modern public service network that can't reach everyone, revealing gaps in the reach of state power. It's interesting to note that even in precarious conditions, the Romans valued the appearance of hygiene. Perfumes, oils, and baths. In the thermal baths helped disguise the effects of poor sanitation. There was a concern with appearing clean, even when reality dictated otherwise. It's like someone who, without running water at home, finds creative alternatives to maintain a presentable appearance in everyday life. And while filth challenged urban life, there was one essential pillar that supported the entire structure of Rome: agriculture. It was from agriculture that came wheat for bread, grapes for wine, and olives for oil, the staple diet of rich and poor alike. In ancient Rome, agriculture was the true foundation of society. No spectacle, army, or commerce could be sustained without the work of the fields. Wheat, above all, was the staple of the diet, transformed into bread or polenta that reached the tables of rich and poor alike. Olive oil and wine also completed the Roman diet. All of this came from the extensive plantations spread throughout the empire, cultivated with the constant effort of peasants and slaves. Interestingly, agriculture was not only a means of survival, but also a symbol of Roman identity. Many senators and patricians took pride in owning land and cultivating an image of countrymen, even though they spent most of their time in Rome. It was a way to reclaim the ideal of simplicity and discipline associated with the city's rural past. It's like modern politicians who extol their humble origins, even while living in luxury. Much of the productive land was concentrated in the hands of the wealthiest, who owned large estates called latifundia. These immense tracts of land were worked by slaves under harsh conditions, producing on a large scale to supply cities and even export to other regions of the empire. Meanwhile, small free farmers struggled to compete, often losing their land and migrating to Rome in search of a livelihood. This migration inflated the urban population and exacerbated inequalities. Agricultural production also had a strategic importance. Rome depended on conquered regions to guarantee its supply, such as Egypt, which provided wheat on a large scale. Controlling these territories meant keeping the people satisfied and preventing revolts. It's as if each grain harvested was also a grain of political power. It's no coincidence that rulers were so concerned with the logistics of supply. Even with the grandeur of the plantations, rural life was marked by simplicity. Peasants plowed the land with rudimentary tools, harvested crops under the scorching sun, and stored them in wooden barns. It was hard work, but indispensable. Urban life depended directly on this nearly invisible effort. Just as many modern cities today are sustained by distant agricultural labor, Rome only existed because the countryside never stopped. And to organize this cycle of planting, harvesting, and land related festivities, the Romans relied on something essential: calendars. They weren't just a way to measure time, but a way to harmonize religion, work, and politics within the same framework. In ancient Rome, the calendar was not just a tool for marking time, but a guide that organized all collective life. Religious festivals, agricultural harvests, political elections, and even battles were planned according to official dates. It was as if the city's rhythm was entirely subject to the pages of this calendar. It wasn't just days and months, but a structure that united the human with the divine. The Roman calendar underwent several reforms over time. Initially, it was lunar, which created confusion and mismatches between seasons. To correct this, Julius Caesar instituted the Julian calendar based on the solar cycle, which was much more accurate. This change ensured stability and predictability for the empire's activities. It's curious to think that even today, our timekeeping is still rooted in this model created over 2,000 years ago. Beyond the practical counting, the calendar was replete with religious festivals. There were days dedicated to specific gods, such as Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, each with rituals and celebration. These dates united the population in feasts, processions, and sacrifices, creating an atmosphere of communion. For the Romans, participating in these rites was not only devotion, but also citizenship. Being present strengthened the bond with the community and the god. Political activities were also guided by the calendar. Assemblies, votes, and even Senate sessions observed days considered favorable or unfavorable by the priests. It was a mixture of superstition and pragmatism. Imagine today a country where Congress only votes on good luck days defined by religious experts. This detail shows how deeply intertwined religion and politics were. For farmers, the calendar was a survival map. It marked the ideal planting and harvesting periods, as well as indicated celebrations linked to the land's fertility. It was a way of turning time into an ally, ensuring efficient rural work. The synchronicity between calendar and agriculture revealed the practical wisdom of a people who depended heavily on nature. And amid this organization of days and omens, the Romans also believed that the future could be anticipated. It was common to turn to omens, importance to interpret the signs of the gods, before any important decision, a habit that reinforced the idea that nothing in life happened by chance. In ancient Rome, few important steps were taken without first consulting the omens. Omens were interpretations of signs from nature made by specialized priests called augurs. They observed the flight of birds, the sound of thunder, even the way certain animals move. For the Romans, the gods communicated through these signs, and to ignore them was to risk inviting misfortune. Fate, they believed, was always whispering in everyday life. Before battles, temple inaugurations, or political decisions, omens were consulted. Imagine a general about to march with thousands of soldiers awaiting the response of a priest watching the sky. A crow's errant flight could postpone an entire campaign. This detail demonstrates how spirituality was intertwined with strategy. Even the most powerful commander knew he could not cross the gods without consequences. In addition to omens, there were omens derived from animal sacrifices. The viscera, especially the liver, were carefully examined to reveal hidden signs. To us, this may seem strange or superstitious, but to the Romans, it was sacred science. The future was written on the bodies of the offerings. Interestingly, similar practices existed in several ancient cultures, revealing a human pattern of seeking certainty amid the unknown. These beliefs weren't limited to rulers. Ordinary citizens also interpreted small signs in their daily lives. A stumble before leaving home, an unexpected encounter, even the way the wind blew, could be interpreted as divine messages. It was like living in a constantly coded world where nothing happened by chance. This mindset gave the Romans both hope and Even so, there were those who criticized the excessive reliance on omens. Some philosophers argued that humans should trust reason more than sign. But in a society where the unpredictable was so prevalent, wars, plagues, fires, believing that the gods provided clues was a way to feel some control. Faith in the invisible, in this case, served as a relief from life's uncertainty. And as the day drew to a close, after so much noise, belief, and activity, Rome was plunged into a different atmosphere. Dusk brought with it a new routine, marked by darkness, the relative silence of the streets, and the preparation for the rest that brought another cycle to a close. As the sun sank behind the hills, Rome's rhythm changed. The bustling streets began to empty, merchants closed their taverns, and carts slowed. Lighting was limited to torches and lanterns, casting shadows that danced on the walls of buildings. The constant din of the city gave way to a relative silence, interrupted only by low conversations or hurried footsteps. The end of the day brought with it an air of respite, almost of relief. In the wealthiest homes, nightfall was accompanied by music, long meals and conversations in brightly lit rooms. Servants circulated discreetly, ensuring that nothing was lacking. In the insulae, the routine was much simpler. Families gathered in small rooms, sharing modest meals and bedtime stories. In both settings, the goal was the same: to recharge for the next day, which would certainly be filled with work and obligations. Children were often lulled to sleep by stories told by their elders. Tales of heroes, gods, and battles fueled their imaginations and reinforced cultural values. It was a way of passing on traditions in everyday life. It's curious to note how, to this day, families maintain this habit of telling bedtime stories, creating bonds that span generations. In Rome, the simple act of storytelling was a form of education. Rest, however, was not equal for everyone. While patricians slept in spacious rooms on more comfortable mattresses, plebeians and slaves slept on makeshift beds, often sharing space in precarious conditions. This inequality was present even in the most intimate details, such as sleeping, but despite the differences, fatigue leveled everyone. Rich and poor alike shared the need for rest, and amid the silence of the night, there were also fears. The darkness brought with it the uncertainty of sudden fires, robberies, or riots. Without the electric light we know today, every shadow could hide a danger. Still, the city allowed itself to rest, trusting that the sunrise would bring movement, work, and hope once again. The cycle of Roman life closed and began anew. This repetitive rhythm between intense days and silent nights was part of the essence of ancient, and it is in this rhythm that we conclude our journey through an ordinary day for its citizens, already preparing the ground for reflection on how all this knowledge can inspire us in the present. So, after spending a whole day in ancient Rome, have you realized how many details of ordinary life shaped the greatness of an empire? It wasn't just emperors or generals who sustained Rome, but ordinary citizens, with their simple polenta, their trips to the baths, their routines in the noisy streets. This shows that the true strength of a civilization is born in everyday life. Now I ask you, do you value the details of your own routine enough? How many times have you looked at the trivialities of your day and missed the opportunity to learn from them? Perhaps what you call boring is precisely what's building your discipline, your strength, and even your future. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is your life, but every small habit, every seemingly boring repetition can be the foundation of your personal greatness. Think about it. What seems insignificant today may be remembered tomorrow as the foundation of your story. Are you willing to transform your routine into something that strengthens you rather than just exhaust you? It's a choice only you can make. And since we've come this far together, I want to challenge you. If you could bring a single Roman custom into your life today, what would it be? The siesta, family rituals, the discipline of rhetoric? Answer in the comments because I really want to hear your perspective. Oh, and don't forget, if this content made you reflect or learn something new, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue following our upcoming stories and delve with me into details that almost no one else reveals, but that make all the difference.